Hey, everybody. I am thrilled to have Neil Martin with me today, who is Honorary Professor of Psychology at Regent's University in London. And he's also the author of the fantastic book, The Psychology of Comedy, which we're going to be doing a deep dive into today. But Neil, you've done so many different things. Is there anything else people should know about you and your connections to comedy?
You call the book fantastic, and that's all I'm interested in.
Okay.
Well, the journey to psychology. I don't want to bore people early on, but in terms of autobiography, I've always been interested in comedy. I used to write sort of jokes and sketches to TV and radio when I was younger. I had my first joke on Steve Wright in the Afternoon, and if I'd really desperate, and I mean desperate, I might tell you what it is a bit later on.
Oh, you're going to have to. Yeah.
Okay.
Keep you to that.
We'll have to have some sort of competition. The competition winner will get a private viewing of that joke, maybe. And then I sort of started writing for the local newspaper. I had a column called Neil Martin's Fascinating Facts column, but in Welsh, which meant that the readership was somewhat limited.
Right.
It was based on a book that Giles Brandreth did called Giles Brandreth's Fascinating Facts. It didn't pinch from the book. It was that was the idea. Then I went to university. My undergraduate thesis was on the effect of audience laughter on men and women's responses to humour. And that excited me so much. I went on and did my PhD at Warwick on the brain's response to food aroma, because that's the natural leapfrog you would make between comedy and that. But I was still interested in comedy, though. So when I was doing my PhD, I started writing for Deadpan magazine, which people might remember at the time. Well, it still is. It was the UK's first national magazine about comedy, not a comic magazine, but about comedy. And it lasted for about 13 issues, and then a couple of other magazines came after that. So eventually, I became its books editor, and I used to sort of review some comedians for it. But I've always had that interest in comedy, the scientific interest in comedy, which is not sort of broader questions like, why do we laugh? What makes us funny? Because those questions are too big. You simply cannot answer them. But you can answer very specific scientific questions, such as, do people respond more positively to audio than audiovisual forms of comedy? Can you measure cross-cultural differences to comedy? Does laughter benefit you in some health capacity? Does it improve your well-being and reduce anxiety? All those sort of specific questions you can look at. So then when I developed what passes for a career in psychology, I spend a bit of my time still looking at the psychology of humour. And then, as you said very kindly, the Psychology of Comedy book came out about, just after lockdown. So it was written during lockdown. And that was trying to condense sort of what we know and what we don't know in the psychology of comedy. And I tried to look at most of the major areas. There's not much research on it compared to, other topics, but there is some, and some of it is quite interesting.
And why do you think there's not so much research on it compared to other areas?
It's a little bit, there are certain subjects in psychology which people have tended to sort of shy away for various reasons. Either career reasons, lack of interest reasons, or importance reasons. If you think of horror, for example, and the sense of smell, less so taste, but the sense of smell, and comedy, they're considered to be sort of minor subjects, in a way, compared to, say, illness and vision and stress, which are perceived to be important topics to study in psychology. I've sort of taken the opposite view, in that all three of these are very important for human beings. Joel Morris has just brought a book out you may know called Be Funny or Die.
Yeah.
He argues that, be funny or die, in the title. The sense of smell is very similar. Most people think, when they have a cold, that they can't taste anything. It's completely wrong. You can taste. What you can't do is smell the food, because flavors are like 80% olfactory. And so because of these sort of topics have a reputation for being, and I'm going to use the cliche, the Cinderella of the behavioral sciences. And I think with humor specifically, the neglect or the stigma has been pretty embedded, because psychology has always had like a tenderness taboo. Most of the work you tended to find in textbooks was on negative emotion, and perhaps correctly, because those are the emotions that are most likely to affect us personally, our health and our well-being. So you want to study those in order to stop you being unwell and to stop you being unhealthy. So you can understand the rationale. So, anxiety, depression, anger, fear, all those sort of things. Also, those negative emotions are much easier to study in a laboratory. So fear is the most widely studied emotion in psychology, of the basic 6 emotions or so. But it's easy to study because you can study that in animals, because the behavioral response you get to an afraid animal is pretty well demarcated. Whereas happiness, joy, excitement, it's a little fuzzier. So up until probably about 50 years ago, you tended to find that lots of textbooks had this tenderness taboo, but it is sort of changing now. It's changing very slowly, but it is. And then in terms of humour, I just think, frankly, I don't think it's regarded as being a topic of particular importance that people don't feel is important to study. Even when you look at the health work involving humour, such as, does generating laughter make you feel better? Does it improve your health and all those sort of things? Even there's not much work. And even those sort of workshops are looked upon rather dismissively as being, slightly trivial, or as being, slightly epiphenomenal to the daily world. I mean, I would argue the opposite. It's not as important as other subjects, clearly, but I still think it is important because it's a key component of human life, especially in the Western world. We need to be a bit careful because often when we talk about humour and comedy, we tend to have like a Western lens through which we see it. And of course, there are some cross-cultural differences in the way we use humour and the way we appreciate it as well. So that's a very long-winded answer to your very short question.
No, that's great. And because obviously I think it's super important, or I wouldn't be devoting so much time to asking these kinds of questions. Absolutely. And I was interested in the book. There was an interesting section about gallows humour, which was something that kind of put language to something that I was interested in at quite a young age, because my dad was a deep sea diver and was involved in doing the clean operation for Piper Alpha, which, for listeners who don't know, was a big oil disaster. Lots of fatalities. Yeah,
I was literally in Aberdeen. My first degree was in Aberdeen. I was studying in Aberdeen when Piper Alpha happened.
Were you? Yeah. So a big disaster and doing the cleanup of it. So there was lots of things that he talked about, and talked about the culture, and felt a lot of shame around afterwards for jokes that people were making. And I had a sense very early on that it's a necessary, if not so spoken about, part. And you hear people who are paramedics, who are police officers, who have been involved in all kinds of situations, who have gallows humour, and we do when it's related to funerals or different things. So I think it's super interesting. And you talked in the book about it potentially like numbing painful thoughts. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit more to that, like what you think the role of gallows humour is, or any of the research on it.
There's not much research on it. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. I think in answer to any of the questions, I'm going to say,
that's okay.
Research. I mean, there's quite a bit of research on sex differences, interestingly, but and laughter, but not on these sort of fairly specific topics. Yeah, I mean, gallows humour. The one way of conceiving it has been as a form of emotional anesthesia. So it sort of protects you from the trauma and the absolute horror of what you're encountering, and therefore you adopt, either deliberately or not deliberately, this barrier between you and the horrific, event or the horrific stimulus. So in that sense, you could see it as a coping mechanism or a coping device. I mean, that is amongst those who want to cope. I mean, we have to concede that there may be some people who make, jokes that are what would be considered slightly bad taste because they have bad taste. And, they're not particularly pleasant people. So they will make these sort of comments. But what you tend to hear is from, people who do work in industries such as, the paramedic industry and even, medicine. Doctors face death daily, patients die. And you become inured to the death at some point because it's part of the job. And then what you tend to find is that using humour as a coping mechanism can become, therefore, much more of a common way of just treating the job, which can seem to an outsider as being maybe somewhat callous and impersonal. But it's simply because, you've been exposed to this material for so long. You've developed some sort of resistance to its negative impact.
Yeah.
But there's not much work on it, apart from, as I say, to suggest that people use it as a coping mechanism. I mean, most.
Yeah. And I loved in the book that you went into so many humour theories that I hadn't heard of before. And I hadn't heard of the Humour Styles Questionnaire, for example, measuring the 4 different styles of humour. But I found that interesting, both in terms of kind of diagnosing what it is that I like to create in comedy and also what I like to consume in comedy and the kinds of comedy I don't. It gave me some language around that. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind introducing it to listeners who haven't come across that, any of the categories and kind of what goes into them.
Humour researchers love their questionnaires.
Right.
There's a brilliant book by Wilhelm Ruch called The Sense of Humour, which is a book about the sense of humour. And at the back, he has a collection of over 100 different questionnaires that people have used just to study humour.
Right.
And in terms of the theories of humour as well, I mean, there are sort of 3, possibly 4 broad theories of humour, but they tend to be theories of laughter. This is where it gets a little bit messy, because we often talk about humour and comedy, but many of the theories are about laughter, like why do we laugh and what makes us laugh? But let's park that for the time being. So there are about 88 individual theories of humour and laughter, but there are sort of 3 or 4 basic ones. And the question that you mentioned, which is the Humour Styles Questionnaire of Martin et al. 2023, not this Martin, the Canadian Martin, who's Rod Martin. It is a questionnaire which seeks to determine the types of ways in which people can be classified according to the way they use humour. And on the basis of that questionnaire, it's about 64 items or such, they were able to condense those items into 4 factors. And they were self-effacing, affiliative, self-defeating, and then aggressive. Now, the aggressive one, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. So it's people use humour in a very melanic, aggressive way, and a very sort of Platonic way, ironically, because, Plato's views of laughter, as was Aristotle's, was not positive. I mean, Plato argued that laughter derives from malice, and their views of humour wasn't very positive. So that's an easy one. Then you've got affiliative humour, and that's the ability to use humour in order to get on with others. Yeah. And that's a positive factor. So that does correlate with lots of things like well-being, low anxiety, low depression, and so on. And then you have the self-enhancing, which is the ability to use humour to enhance the self. And that has some pros and has some cons, but generally positive. Self-defeating, on the other hand, tends to be, although it might seem rather to signify modesty, there is evidence to suggest that that is associated with slightly more negative personality traits like neuroticism and fear of other people and fear of disease and fear of contagion and so on. So it's using humour in order to negatively project yourself, hence self-defeating humour. So it's a big question. It's very widely used, and lots of work has been done correlating those factors with, for example, personality and well-being and stress and anxiety and depression and all sorts of other sort of variables. I mean, the one thing that comes across fairly consistently is that the affiliative humour factor is the one that tends to correlate most positively with positive personality traits, things like openness to experience and conscientiousness and extroversion. And again, stop me if you're not familiar with all this jargony stuff in psychology, but in personality psychology at the moment, the current dominant model is the Big 5 model, which suggests that we all differ across 5 personality dimensions. It's called the ocean model. O for openness, this is where I get it wrong. O for openness to experience, C for conscientiousness, E for extroversion, A for agreeableness, N for neuroticism. Yes, right.
Yes.
So that's where most of the work has occurred.
Yeah. And what are some of the shows that you have really enjoyed watching or listening to, and where do you think they fit within that, if they fit at all? Or do you think they kind of use a blend?
Well, that is such a brilliant question. I think it's a brilliant question because it's so difficult to answer. If you ask somebody, "Oh, what's your favorite comedy?" It's about saying, "What's your favorite film?" I mean, it's almost impossible to answer. I mean, I do remember. Well, actually, okay. Let's work backwards.
Okay.
The most recent thing I've watched, which I thought was absolutely outstanding, was Hacks.
Oh, I love Hacks. It's coming back. I think next series tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it isn't just the script. The script is brilliant, but it's the performances. The two key performances have such comedic brilliance to them. I mean, one is understated. One could have gone completely exuberant, but didn't, and sort of reined it in. And the combination of those two, I thought, was brilliant. And there's a joke about Bill Cosby's pharmacy in season 1 that has stayed with me ever since, because I remember laughing out loud when I heard it on screen. So that's a brilliant one. And then I remember when I was, growing up, you were brought up with comics. So, the Beano, Crazy, Cheeky, all those sort of things. Those are things that made you laugh, Mustache Million and Grimly Fiendish and all those sort of things. And then you have the load of ITV sitcoms like, Rising Damp, even Mind Your Language, which you look at it now and you think, my word, how did that ever get to have a many series that it did? And then, for me, something changed. I liked sort of humour that was quite cutting. So Not the 9 o'clock news, I thought was outstanding. And the album Kinda Lingers, I think it's probably the best double album of comedy ever created. And I had the opportunity to meet John Lloyd sort of last year. We were doing a TV thing together, and by coincidence he was doing the same thing. We did like a Talking Heads thing, and I very rarely get starstruck. I'm a psychologist, Danielle. I'm trained to predict and understand human behavior, but honestly, meeting John Lloyd was one of the highlights of my career. And then when we went to the Joel Morris book launch, who should I see outside but John Lloyd again? So, kismet. So that album is an absolute work of genius. So things like that. And also Carrot's Lib was a favorite program at the time, which was live. It was Saturday evening. It had a raft of really well-known comedy writers at the time. Which, if you Neil Shand and, the Tony Sarchett, all these people who were writing all the comedy back in the 80s on BBC and ITV, mainly BBC rather than ITV. So that, when I was younger, that's what I loved, that sort of comedy. And then, you come through to the modern times, and you've got, The Office and the thick of it, and The League of Gentlemen. Inside Number 9, that sort of comedy. I love to bits. The comedy that is very, very clever, that often you don't laugh at, but internally you go, "Oh yes, that's a good."
Okay.
How about you? What's your top 3?
Also, massive fan of Hacks. Brilliant show. I'm really excited for the new season, which is coming out imminently. Yeah. I think a lot of the things you'll recognise from previous episodes, listeners, because I like to give a shout out to books as well, because I think comedy is really hard to do in a novel. So really, more recently, I've read Amped by Ken Pisani, and Ken was a guest on the show. It was a Thurber Prize finalist. Trevor Noah won, but Ken was a finalist, and it's a genius book. And oh gosh, so many things that I would put under comedy drama now. So like Shrinking, for example, comedy drama. It was on Apple. Really brilliant. And you said 3, but I have only recently watched Fleabag as well, which so many people tell me to watch. Again, shout out to Chris Head, who's been on the show, who recommended it to me and showed some clips, and it's just taken me this long to get around to it, and it's as brilliant as everyone said. I thought it was.
It's very similar to Fawlty Towers in that they produced 2 very short, brilliant series of about 6 episodes each, and then just left it. And each one of them is completely standalone and absolutely exceptional. And weirdly, I was reading the play in which it was based recently, just like a stack of things, prefaces from the original producer and director and so on, and the amount of work that went through that, to sort of test that material before it got to the television stage. Yeah, it's still amazing how much you saw on screen was in the original. Play in, was it the Soho Theatre or Leicester Square? Leicester Square, I think.
Don't remember. Yeah, don't remember.
But the other things they sort of tweaked along the way. But the evolution of that and how it began, and it took so long. The gestation was so long before it got to, the TV was, just extraordinary.
But I think it shows in the quality of it. I mean, I just kept watching so many things, and it was just like, because I do watch things with, a writer's hat on as well, as I'm sure many comedy lovers do too. And this one, I just kept saying to my husband after every episode, I was like, I have no notes. I don't know how it could be made better. Just everything, the performances, the writing, amazing. And so when you watch things or listen to things or read things, do you, when you do so with your psychology hat on, if you do, what kind of things come to mind? Like, do you end up being like, oh, that's interesting, they're using that theory, or, oh, if they thought about this, it could have been strengthened, or are you able to just be a viewer and enjoy it?
Yeah, I think Terry Jones said that, unlike tragedy, bad comedy makes people angry. And that's the thing about, really bad comedy, it really gets people riled, and everybody has a view about bad comedy. Good comedy is sort of slightly different, because then you think, oh, that you can see how certain constructions were made, how certain glances were exchanged, and how that contributes to the comedy. So when I'm looking at something that I think is good, I think it's good because it seems effortless. It's effortful when you find yourself being pulled out of it, and you're like an observer to the comedy rather than observing the comedy. See what I mean? So you look at it and say, oh, well, I see what they're trying to do there, but this doesn't sort of work because they've done this, that, and the other. Or it may be too broad. I mean, I'm not a big fan of broad humor, although broad humor, Miranda has elements of broad humor, which is, I think, absolutely, spectacular. But, things like Mrs. Brown's Boys, I mean, I know Shaka Asongu and all that, but it's one I've found very hard to sort of take to my bosom. So when I'm looking at it, I genuinely don't think as a psychologist, because the sort of psychology research I do is about not about creating jokes and how do they make people laugh. It's about looking at the other things that can influence our response to comedy. Whether it's, just as examples, whether it's temperature or lighting or having other people there, having people of different sexes, having people of different classes, different races, those sort of influences, whether the laughter is canned or not, whether the laughter is appropriate or not. I mean, when I look at comedy, I look on it with an appreciation for the skill and the art, because it is a skill. And it is not, and that's what I have the appreciation for. And I'm sort of, I'm in awe of people who can create that level of work. And often you think, oh, must have spent ages on that, and then you discover it was like a last-minute thing where they had to do a script like the night before, and they produced the best thing ever. I mean, the one example I will give you that is probably the best example of this, simply because it was just created by one man, and that was Only Fools and Horses. John Sullivan. I mean, to have produced that level of consistent comedy across decades, produced by just one person, is phenomenal. And it's properly Shakespearean because, and I don't mean that to be pompous, but you can look at all of those now and watch them as if you watch them for the first time. Although the scenery dates, the currency dates, lots of other things date, the clothes definitely date, the comedy is actually timeless because it's about the relationships and language and how those two, interact. So Only Fools and Horses, I forgot Only Fools and Horses, I think is absolutely outstanding.
And when you meet people who are interested in comedy but haven't read your book yet and are asking you about it,
you're saying nobody's read my book yet?
No, I'm sure that there's so many books in the world, isn't there? And I have, and I've got lots of questions, but I'm just interested when they're asking, and if they do show a genuine interest in comedy and they're asking about the research or asking about the different theories, are there favourite ones that you love to share? Because I have particular ones I'm going to ask you about, but I just wondered if they're genuinely interested, what do you like to share from the book?
Do you mean like in terms of research?
In terms of research or theories or things that they might not have heard about or know about?
Yes, actually. I mean, I was going to say one's dull, but it's not really dull, but it's interesting, and that is how laughter affects us. There's this notion that laughter is contagious. And I mentioned my undergraduate thesis earlier. I mean, that was born out of the fact that I was looking at the literature. Again, not very much of it. It's about 20 papers or so. But there was a theme coming through which suggested that women and girls, rather than boys and men, were more influenced by laughter. What they found was that that girls and women laughed more, but also found the comedy funnier when there was an audience, when there was a laughter track accompanying the comedy. But I had to look at the literature, and I thought, well, actually, this isn't consistent. And some studies have looked at adults, some have looked at, girls. So it's a bit of a mess. And also methodologically, the area at the time was not what you might call particularly sound. So what I decided to do was, okay, let's examine sex differences to humour in the presence of audience laughter. So I had a radio show, which was topical at the time, and I selected the quickies in that radio show that had the most live audience laughter. And then I sort of edited the tape together so that I'd keep the jokes with the laughter in, and then for another group of participants, I had the same comedy, but with the laughter removed and pauses in between the jokes, and then asked men and women to listen, different groups of men and women, to listen to both. What I found was that there was no sex difference, as I sort of predicted, but laughter had a statistically significant effect, not just on the behavioral response. So people laughed more in the presence of audience laughter, but they also found the comedy funnier and more enjoyable as well. And it sort of give light the canard about canned laughter being irritating, which has a grain of truth in it, because if canned laughter is used inappropriately, you just shoehorn it in whenever there's a joke just to signal in the joke, it is the comedy isn't going to be funny because audience realize that isn't a natural reaction. On the flip side, though, you might remember when Ben Elton produced his first sitcom as a solo writer, just Happy Families, which had Jennifer Saunders playing different characters of a family throughout 6 series, and the producer at the time was bemoaning the fact that it wasn't well received, and it wasn't, especially after the young ones, But he said, well, the problem was it was stuffed full of jokes, but there was no laughter track to signal them in. So I think his reasoning was that had you shown it to like a live studio audience, they could have seen it on screen, they would have laughed along with it, and therefore the response would have been sort of slightly more positive. And so that's what I found in that sort of little study that we did, and I think that's an interesting study because it shows how important an audience's laughter might be to the general experience of comedy. Even if maybe ironically, given what I've just said, most of us watch comedy maybe on our own or with a couple of other people on television, where there is no audience, and often where there is no audience on the comedy. I mean, Hacks, we've just talked about, has no comedy track. The Office has no comedy. League of Gentlemen, none of these, have comedy tracks. So that was one.
Fascinating.
So the other one that I think is, there are a couple of ones really. I mean, the research about learning is interesting. So, if you use humour during your lectures, for example, you try to teach somebody something, does that work? And the evidence suggests that it is. There was one study of university courses that found that 80% of them featured lecturers who used humour or comedy in some way. And it tends to work because students who attend lectures where the tutor tends to be quite humorous tend to do rather better in the exams, a bit later on. Where the humour doesn't work is if you try and introduce humour in an exam question. And believe me, some people have tried doing this.
Oh, really?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, it's the last thing you want when you're sitting an exam to, your tutor to sort of. And by the way, it's your tutor, not a professional comedian, introducing a joke when you're trying to answer a question about two-way mixed analysis of variance of something. Yeah. You're much too stressed. So that research I think is interesting, and then the other field I think is interesting is in 2 parts. One is sex differences, and whether men and women enjoy different types of comedy and produce different amounts of comedy. Now, the answer to the first one is probably no. There's not much of a sex difference between in terms of enjoyment of comedy. So men and women tend to like the same sort of things by and large. There is, though, a difference when it comes to, so again, the term is humour production ability.
Right.
Psychologists have to have a term for everything. So this is, the ability to produce humour. And men tend to produce more of it than do women. And there may be a reason for that. Come on to it in a second. And then the other interesting question is, and this is much more controversial, and that is, and it's not a question I like asking because it seems such a facile, stupid question to which the answer is obviously no. And that is, are men funnier than women? Now, the answer to that is clearly no, because obviously not, because there are many funny men, there are many unfunny men, there are many funny women, there are many unfunny women. But the question is often asked, are women funny? Well, of course, it's a ridiculous question to ask. I remember, I think it was David Baddiel's wife, whose name escapes me now, who co-wrote some of the scripts for Slow Horses.
Oh, so good.
Moana Banks.
Of course.
So she co-wrote a book about funny women back in the 90s, I think. And when she was working at the BBC at the time, and in the preface she tells this anecdote. She was telling a very senior management person at the BBC she was writing a book about women and comedy. And he said to her, "Oh, that'll be a short book." So it just shows you the sort of stigma and the sort of, the neglect and the standoffishness that existed in some parts of, the media world at that time. I don't think it's there much anymore, but, it was telling, I think, that comment. So tied to that, but there is some research to suggest, interestingly, that both men and women find men funnier, which is an interesting, finding. There was a review published, I think it was by Greengross back in 2020, where they did a meta-analysis of all the papers, and this was the finding that sort of came out. Other studies have found that, by and large, men tend to produce about 63 to 65% of all humour attempts, as they call it. Men tend to deploy or use or produce humour more than do women, and I think that is maybe tied to the other strand of this research, and that is mating. Obviously, Danielle, everything goes back to sex, isn't it? Or maybe not. But one reason for this, why men produce more humour or comedy than do women, the evolutionary psychologist suggests, is that it is a mental fitness indicator. So if you look at Lonely Hearts adverts, you tend to find that men tend to ask for specific things. Women tend to ask for specific things. Women tend to ask for sense of humour in a partner, usually male. Men don't. Men go for sort of more physical attributes, or frothy, bubbly, and all that sort of shallow nonsense, right? Women cite wanting someone with a sense of humour. So that difference is interesting. And when you ask men and women to rank the traits in a potential mate that they think is more important, again, for women, sense of humour comes much further up the top of the scale than it does for men. And so the reason for that phenomenon is thought to be this mental fitness indicator. And what it means is this, that men use humour because in some way it indicates their mental fitness. Because in order to produce comedy, you have to be quite clever. You have to be quite verbally adept. You have to be quite cognitively agile. You have to see relations between two things that don't necessarily go together. So it's seen as a way of competing with another mate. This is how evolutionary psychologists talk. Danielle, don't tell me off. I'm simply a messenger. This is how they phrase it. So and that research is interesting because if you look at the data that's examined, say, verbal IQ and production of humour, those people with the higher verbal IQs are the ones that tend to produce the most humour and also tend to generate the funniest comedy as well. So there is, not very much, but there is some link between intelligence, or at least some subscales of intelligence, and the production of humour. So those little bits, I think, are interesting. The well-being stuff is interesting as well, I suppose. I mean, there's quite a bit of research showing that simulated laughter has been associated with a reduction in stress and negative well-being and an improvement in well-being and feeling happy. As opposed to, natural laughter. I mean, simulated laughter is where you get people just to laugh, like as they do in these sort of therapy sessions that you can see online. But whether that's because of the laughter or the physical motor act of moving your muscles here, I mean, it could be that other types of motor activity will produce the same uplift in mood, who knows. But that's what the current reviews, anyway, seem to suggest.
No, I have so many questions, and I know you won't be able to answer this, but I'm wondering, and this is just my wondering with no scientific fact behind it. If I'd be super curious to look at what these studies are and how they're designed and what kind of humor and how jokes based it is and who the subjects of the jokes are and in what context. And I would love to unpick all of that, because I do wonder if, in the same way that now so many studies, they've looked at the fact that, for example, there's a lot of the places that studies are done, they have access to a lot of students, and a lot of those students who have the time to do it are white male students, and then they base their data off that. So I'd be very curious to unpick so much of this. I think it's a super fascinating area in terms of, because there's so many kinds of humor. And I think about all the different kinds of humor that I use with my friends and my female friends. I'm like, would they have even showed up in the study? And would they have had a label for that? And super interesting.
It's a really important question. And it's an important observation. I mean, a couple of things to say, three things actually to say. The male thing, probably not as relevant, because most studies now tend to include half and half. Unless it was a particularly bad journal or the editorial practices were extremely lax, it would be very unusual for a study like that to be published these days, or even a study with a low N. I mean, a low number of participants. So, which again was a big problem, back in before the 1990s, publishing studies with 20 or 40 people was quite common. And of course, that's what's called, underpowered in the literature. So, you haven't got enough participants basically to draw a conclusion. The student issue is a very good point. And, one of the criticisms has been of psychology is that its samples are weird, Western, educated, industrialized, what's the other one? From democracies, that's rich was the other one. I knew I'd get them in the right order somehow. It's like an audiovisual dyslexia here, Danielle. That is sort of changing sort of slightly slowly because there's not much work done in humour. So you don't get as much of it as you do in other areas of, psychology where people have paid attention to this bias and have tried to rectify it. So I think that's a really important caveat, as is the caveat you made about materials, actually. I mean, it's a perfectly valid point. I mean, a lot of the studies that were carried out in the 60s, 70s and 80s, you look back at them now and you think, one, how did they choose these materials? Why did they choose these materials? Because they weren't particularly funny to many people's ears. And then you sort of discover that in some of the studies as well, the materials were created by the researcher. And in some cases, even performed by the researcher. So you had, the author of the paper doing the stand-up routine to the participants, which isn't sort of how you do it these days. So these days, though, I would like to think, and it's something I do in my studies, that if you do choose a piece of humour or a piece of comedy, then you do a pilot test, or not just that, but other pieces of comedy as well. And so you make sure that the comedy that you're choosing and your aims for it have been confirmed by the pilot group, and even if you use things like cartoons or jokes. I remember a couple of years ago, I had a poor student, he wanted to do this, but this is what he had to do. He wanted to give people a series of jokes. Some of them were sexist, some of them were not sexist, in order to determine people's perception of sexist jokes. But in order to determine the most sexist and the least sexist, he had to do a pilot study where he administered about 50 of each to a group of pilot participants, and they then, made their judgments to whittle them down to about, 10 in each category. So if you do your research properly, that is what you do now.
Right.
You don't just think, oh, well, I think this is funny, we'll stick it in, and everybody shares the same opinion of comedy as I do. Because often, Mrs. Brown's Boys, that opinion is not shared.
Yeah, so many kinds of comedy, and comedy for everybody, and they're saying, and we find different things funny as well, I think, based on our context. And there are some contexts that are still developing, and so many things I could ask you about. And I can see we're coming up on time soon, and I've only got to a fraction of my questions. So I'd love to ask you.
I'll give you one word answer. So it's 3-word answer.
No, you don't have to, because it is a subject that merits this interesting discussion. So I'd love to know just if there's any aspects of comedy that you have hunches about that you haven't been able to study or haven't been able to study conclusively, but you think, oh gosh, if I had more time, more money available, and all the magic things you need to make a study that you'd love to kind of test or dig into a little bit more, what would you love to study?
Oh, I think there are lots of things you can still do that people sort of haven't done. Yeah. I mean, one of the studies I was most proud of, but has not been remotely well cited at all, is one we did, and I mentioned it briefly earlier, where we compared people's responses to a script, an audio, and an audiovisual version of the same.
That is interesting.
Because I wanted to see, well, does the medium, does the format of the comedy influence, your perception of it? So we used a type of comedy that was available in all 3 formats, which was the Dish and Dishonesty episode from Blackadder 3.
Oh, amazing.
So we had people reading the script, we had them listening to the audio tape, or we had them watching the sitcom. And we had, cameras, video recording, their smiling and their laughter. And then we asked them to rate the funniness and enjoyment and all those sort of things afterwards. And what we found was that the camera sort of inhibited some of the laughter.
Okay.
But people certainly didn't laugh almost at all in the script version. But they didn't find it less funny than the version. Yeah. Okay. And there was no significant difference in the funniness rating between the script and the other two types. And I've always thought that's a really interesting.
I agree.
Study, yeah. And whether having a camera in front of you influences your behavior as well. So, this idea that, being recorded influences your own behavior in slightly different ways. I think there's lots of things you can do. I mean, temperature and lighting, size of screen, I think, is something fascinating.
That is fascinating for how we're consuming media now. That is fascinating.
And I've often thought that in terms of horror as well. So I imagine if you had a massive screen and you're showing a horror film, people would be significantly more horrified than if you just had a TV screen,
Well, I don't know. I'm such a weird when it comes to horror. Shout out to my friend Anandi, who's been on the show. She's brilliant at studying horror comedy and horror, but I am so wimpy. But it's a fascinating area.
Lots of parallels, actually, because, I mean, there's one theory of humour that's very similar to a theory of horror. So there's the reversal, Bellini's reversal theory. No, the arousal model, not the reversal. The arousal model, which states that as we listen to a joke, we hear the setup, then we get the punchline, and that bit there is called the jag, and then there's a decline. So there's like an inverted U of arousal, and then it declines. Similar thing happens in horror. So, you get, walk, 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 thump, and then the horror declines. And it's called the excitation transfer model in horror. And the idea is that if you carried on with that arousal, you wouldn't have a relief from tension, you'd have dread, because it just carry on and it wouldn't be enjoyable anymore. Anyway, lots of parallels.
But that's great. I just think I build up too much dread too early, and then I can't take it in the horror. Exactly. That's why I need it I need the comedy. But that's interesting with the tension. Love it.
And also, the other one thing I would mention, I think no one's done this, is combining smell and comedy. Like would the presence of certain aromas make the comedy less or more funny or more enjoyable?
I have never thought about that. See, that's a new thought for my brain.
I mean, you need to sort of like sound rational. I mean, okay, you could think malodors would make people judge the comedy as maybe even less funny, even though it's not as objectively not less funny than it would be in another presence of another scent. But simply the presence of a malodor would possibly distract you, which means that you're not paying much attention, therefore you don't find it as funny. So there's some problems with malodor. But I often wonder whether, if you had like an alerting odor or a relaxing odor, whether that would, influence your response, even your behavioral response, your laughter and your smiling to comedy.
Fascinating. Oh my goodness. What a fascinating area of work. Thank you so much, Neil, today for stretching my brain and giving me lots of interesting things to chew on and think about. Same for your book. As I say, I wrote down so many other things that I found fascinating in the book. So I do recommend readers and listeners go and find it, The Psychology of Comedy, particularly if you're a comedy nerd like me. So thank you so much, Neil. And where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
And thank you, Danielle, for this, for the podcast as well. It's been great. Thank you. We should do part 2. That's what we should.
I know.
Yes, if you're still on Twitter, some people still are, you can find me there at that Neil Martin. Or if you want to email me, you can email me at neiloncomedy@outlook.com. So get in touch. And if you read the book, let me know what you think. If you bought the book, thank you very much. Means I'll be able to afford some bread this week, so much appreciated. And thank you again for listening to me. And comedy, psychology of comedy is a very interesting world. But there's more of the world to explore, I think.
Perfect. Thank you so much.